Hello and welcome to Nice and Blunt. It's week 6, and these are my top 5 must-start wide receivers. As always, my videos are intended for half PPR leagues, so adjust accordingly. But if you have a question on whether or not to start these players over the guys you already have, who may be studs or not, go ahead and check my wide receiver rankings. I'll put that up here. It'll also be available at the end of the video. But when it comes to these players, I've done a little bit more of a deeper dive, and I have updated my rankings on a few of them. But this guy has stayed the same. He's my number 1 must-start wide receiver this week, and it's JaMaar Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals going up against the Detroit Lions, my wide receiver 16 overall this week. Through the first 5 games, JaMaar Chase is only seeing 7 targets a game and only catching 4.6 receptions, and those both rank outside the top 35 at wide receiver, 36th in targets and 38th in receptions. However, when he does get the ball, he is doing a lot with it. He's averaging 19.8 yards per reception, and that ranks 4th in the NFL among all wide receivers. And on a per game basis, he's averaging 91.2 yards per game, which ranks as wide receiver 7 in that category. So he's really showing up despite a low volume of targets. He's also scoring a touchdown every game, 5 through the first 5 weeks. So that touchdown rate is second best in the NFL among wide receivers, and wide receivers are very touchdown dependent. So if you can get one that scores every week on average, you have a very valuable player on your hands. That's why I think he's a must start. He's averaging 17.4 half PPR points per game, 7th best among all wide receivers. And even though I don't consider him a top 10 wide receiver the rest of the year, he is looking like the number 1 wide receiver in Cincinnati. And if you can only start one, I would definitely prefer JaMaar Chase. This matchup is also pretty good. He's going up against the Lions defense, who are allowing 251 passing yards per game. That ranks 17th in the NFL, so very middle of the pack. They're definitely not exceptional in the secondary. And to wide receivers specifically, they are very susceptible against the deep pass. They're giving up 16.2 yards per reception so far. And if that alone was a wide receiver this season, it would rank as wide receiver 17 out of the top 100 who qualify in this stat. So when you throw on the Lions, you get big chunk plays, and that's why I think JaMaar Chase is going to be utilized a lot in this game. So far, the Lions have only given up 3 touchdowns to wide receivers, whereas they've given 6 up to running backs. But with JaMaar Chase, he can easily take it to the house from anywhere on the field. So you only need one play with JaMaar Chase, and I think even if he doesn't score a touchdown, he's going to have a very high floor. And that's why I've got JaMaar Chase at wide receiver 16 this week. I think he's a clear must-start wide receiver. My next must-start is Brandin Cooks of the Houston Texans. And I had him on this list last week, but I did mention the risk. This week, he is my wide receiver 17. And just yesterday, I had him at wide receiver 22. But as I look at the stats more closely, I need to bump him up. Last week was a dud, yes. Only 5 targets, 3 receptions, and 23 yards. But it was against the Patriots. And we know that Bill Belichick has a tendency of removing the best offensive player from his opponent's game plan. And that's what happened with Brandin Cooks. So let's throw that game out and look at the first 4 games. Brandin Cooks' numbers were eye-popping. 9.8 targets a game in those first 4, 10th best among all wide receivers. 7 receptions a game, which would have ranked 6th best. 92.3 yards a game, ranked as wide receiver 5. And even though he only had 1 touchdown on the year, a very low touchdown rate, he was still putting up a very high floor, 14.2 half PPR points per game. That ranked as 15th in the NFL among all wide receivers. So his floor is really high. He's not touchdown dependent. And last week, it just didn't pay off. I think this week is going to be a big bounce back for Brandin Cooks. And not only will he put up a lot of yards, I am also very confident that he scores a touchdown. The Colts defense so far this season is giving up 261 passing yards per game. That ranks 20th in the NFL. So below average. And to wide receivers specifically, they have given up 10 receiving touchdowns through 5 games. So an average of 2 per game. And if it's going to go to anyone, I think it's going to go to Brandin Cooks first. Last week was a bit of a fluke with that Belichick defensive game plan. So I really trust Brandin Cooks to bounce back. I kind of want to put him higher, but at the end of the day, this is still the Texans. So I can't put him any higher than my wide receiver 17, but I feel very confident in that ranking. A definite top 20 play this week. And the third guy on this list is Robert Woods. I've looked a little bit closer at his stats, and I've bumped him up to my wide receiver 23 this week. Through 5 games, he's getting 7.8 targets, which ranks as wide receiver 20. 5.4 receptions a game is wide receiver 23. And the yards is decent. 64.4 yards per game. It ranks 29th in the league among wide receivers. So a pretty consistent floor as a top 30 play in that regard. And he has scored 2 touchdowns this season. So a touchdown rate of 0.4 on average per game, ranks as wide receiver 26. And so far, he's scored 11.5 PPR points per game this season, and that ranks as wide receiver 27. We all know that week 1 was rather disappointing, and then week 3 was a disappointing game as well, but the other 3 games have actually been very consistent. Last week, 14 targets, 150 receiving yards, so Robert Woods has some potential, and Matthew Stafford is getting a little bit more comfortable throwing the ball to him. And this matchup is also pretty decent. He's playing the Giants on the road, and they've given up 270 passing yards per game. That ranks 22nd in the league, so below average as well. And to wide receivers specifically, they've given up 5 touchdowns through 5 games, so the odds aren't amazing. I think he definitely gets the easier cornerback matchup in this one. Cooper Kupp is going to be covered by James Bradberry, who is one of the best corners in the league, and that's going to open up the door for Robert Woods. And I think Matthew Stafford is going to look in his direction a little bit more than usual. So I really trust Robert Woods this week, and I think you should too. My wide receiver 23 in week 6, a very safe option. But this guy is a little bit more risky, but I still really love his upside. It's Emmanuel Sanders of the Buffalo Bills going up against the Tennessee Titans on Monday night. I have him ranked as my wide receiver 25 at the moment, and through 5 games, his stats are a little bit volatile. 6.2 targets per game, only ranks as wide receiver 47, so not a massive workload. And he's only catching 3.8 receptions per game, less than 4, and that only ranks as wide receiver 52 on a per game basis. So look, there's definitely some risk with Emmanuel Sanders, but when he gets the ball, he produces 16.9 yards per reception is what he's averaging so far this season, and that ranks as wide receiver 13 in the NFL. So pretty good efficiency from Emmanuel Sanders, and he's averaging 64.4 yards per game. So the same as Robert Woods, actually, so tied for 29th among all wide receivers. So despite a limited workload, very good efficiency and a pretty high floor. He's also scoring at a very high rate. 4 touchdowns this season, and that ranks 6th best among all wide receivers, tied for 6th. But like I said, there is risk and volatility with Emmanuel Sanders. 2 of those games, he scored 2 touchdowns, and the other 3, he was held without a touchdown. So there's a bit more of a boom-bust variability with Emmanuel Sanders, but when he does score, he really pays off, and he's been averaging 13.1 half PPR points per game. That ranks as wide receiver 18 this season. So even though he's a bit touchdown dependent, he only needs to break 1 play, and Josh Allen has been looking for him consistently when they are in the opponent's territory. So I really like Emmanuel Sanders' upside, and I think he scores a touchdown this week because he's going up against the Tennessee Titans, whose defense is allowing 265 passing yards per game, ranks 21st in the NFL, so another below average secondary. And to wide receivers specifically, this is where they're doing the bulk of the damage. 224 yards per game out of that 265. That's a lot. And they're very vulnerable to the deep pass. The Titans are giving up 15.2 yards per reception to wide receivers this year. And so far this year, they've been very vulnerable in the end zone. 8 receiving touchdowns to wide receivers through 5 games. And I have a feeling that number's going to go way up this week, and Josh Allen is going to connect for a touchdown with Emmanuel Sanders on Monday night. There's obviously some risk involved, but I really believe in the upside. I want a piece of this game and the Bills' passing attack. So give me Emmanuel Sanders as a must start this week, my wide receiver 25. But because he is risky, I'm going to give you one player who's definitely much safer, and this is my wide receiver 26 this week, Michael Pittman Jr. of the Indianapolis Colts. Through 5 games, he's getting a big workload. 8.6 targets per game, ranks 17th among all wide receivers, and he's catching 5.8 receptions a game. That ranks as wide receiver 15. So especially in PPR formats, Michael Pittman has a very high floor. And when it comes to yards, he's also pretty decent. 73.6 yards per game on average, and that ranks as wide receiver 20 in that category. But he's only scored 1 touchdown so far this year, so a low touchdown rate of 0.2 per game, only ranks as wide receiver 51. But all that means is he is not touchdown dependent because he's scoring 11.5 half PPR points per game, and that ranks as wide receiver 27. So you're getting a reliable top 30 play every week, regardless of whether or not he scores a touchdown. And if he does score, then he would immediately vault into the top 20 at the wide receiver position in that week. This matchup isn't amazing against wide receivers, though. They are playing the Texans, and their defense has been pretty good against the pass. The numbers are kind of skewed because they played Cleveland in week 2, and Jarvis got injured in the beginning of the game. Odell didn't play, so there weren't really any wide receivers to throw to. But otherwise, they're giving up 188 yards per game to wide receivers specifically, and that's pretty decent. I think you can trust the floor for Michael Pittman, and he will have a pretty typical stat line, about 6 catches for around 75 yards or so. And the only concern is that he doesn't score a touchdown. That's the only reason why I don't have him higher. The Texans have been pretty good at limiting opposing wide receivers in the end zone. They've only given up 2 touchdowns this season to wide receivers, and both of those came in week 1 against Jacksonville. So they've kind of locked it down since then, and that's my only concern with Michael Pittman. But the workload is really high. You can trust the floor. I think he is definitely a very safe flex play this week. It's going to be hard for me to justify benching Michael Pittman. So it's going to wrap up my top 5 must-start wide receivers this week. In order, it was JaMaar Chase, Brandin Cooks, Robert Woods, Emmanuel Sanders, and Michael Pittman for week 6. So if you want to check my full half PPR rankings, they'll be available on this video. It'll be available here. And you can also check Instagram. Just a heads up, though, I am about to take a trip to Hawaii for a week. It was planned before the pandemic, and it's happening now. So the videos starting tomorrow are going to be a lot less edited, but I promise you it's only temporary. It's just for a week. I hope you can forgive me while I'm on vacation. I'll still be posting, but they won't be edited like usual. So just a heads up. I hope that's okay with you. Next week, we will be back to normal, I promise. But if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more content. My name is Adam Riancho, and thank you for watching Nice and Blunt.